Hey guys, you seem to like it when I did this last time. In this video, I'm just going to talk about some random video games ideas I've had over the last few years while I try and make a tree in Blender. Blender is a tool that I'm trying to force myself to open at least once a day because I'm terrible. I'm terrible. No, I'm terrible at having these really cool ideas and then writing them all down and doing nothing with them. So while I can't stream because of my voice, I'm trying to be a bit more productive and learn the basics of Blender, learn the basic of Unity. I'm not expecting to make any insanely ambitious projects, but kind of I've made a flat plane and I've put some trees and a goblin in it. Yay, that sort of stuff. I have no idea what I'm doing, so I apologize to any Blender experts who are watching me while I cringe and try and populate my tree that I'm making here. I think we can all agree that sort of looks like a tree, sort of. So, Shift A, add icosphere. I'm gonna try and scale these and make these look like the leafy bits, and then just kind of pop them back. So, random video game ideas I've had over the last few years. I also thought this would be kind of fun, because you guys are used to me complaining about the state of other video games. So you can now be like, lol. Oh, that I completely missed. I'm not very good with the depth perception yet. You can be like, lol. He thinks this is bad. Well, did you hear the terrible idea he had for a thing once? Lol. Yeah, so you'll notice a reoccurring theme through all three of these ideas, and they become more reductive. They become smaller and simpler projects with each one, and the final project is something I'm going to try and make a prototype of, a very scuffed RuneScape looking prototype of, with my terrible assets if I ever get around to finishing them. So, a reoccurring theme in all of my ideas is I hate video games. No, I talk about this a lot in videos. I don't like systems that feel video gamey. My perfect video game would have zero menus, it would have zero UI, everything would be displayed visually. So that means no health bars, no random like action bars, no inventories. Everything is just visual in world. And examples of games that have done stuff like that well, Dead Cells, they kind of just like reinvented slash hid numbers. So in Dead Cells, if you haven't played that, I'll see if I can find a picture of it. Since we have the power of the internet, they hid the HP bar in the guy's suit. Not Dead Cells, Dead Space, the other Dead game. So in Dead Space, your health bar, if you can see this, is there. So in the suit, those are your health blips. Any ammo is like hidden within the gun, because the gun have like little screens, and that all makes sense in world. And you could be like, well, Tarke, that's really basic. You're not removing, you're just hiding. Good. One of my favorite games of last year was Ghost of Tsushima. I think Ghost of Tsushima did an amazing job of reinventing the open world formula by just refining the open. Ooh, that's not what I want to do. By just refining the open world formula. Shrink it down, shrink it down. My computer might be struggling a bit with me doing this. So with that, if you haven't played it, they took the kind of Ubisoft model and said, that's terrible. They had a very small, self-contained world. You didn't have arrows, you didn't have markers, you didn't have quest tracking everywhere. Instead, when you opened up the map, if you decided, I want to go to this town, I want to go to this event, instead of having an arrow that you would follow to go there, the wind in Tsushima would actually blow in the direction I want to be heading. And because of that, the trees would bend and there'd be birds and wind and grass. And that way, like, the whole island became this living thing. And it's a really subtle thing. It sounds very gimmicky, but for anyone who's played that game, they'll be able to tell you, yes, that was actually really, oh god, yeah, my computer's struggling a bit with this. That was actually really effective, and did wonders for, come on, put it right there. Depth perception. It did wonders. Oh no, I have this problem sometimes, right? How do I select? There you go. I'm very bad at selecting half of something. Let's maybe shrink that down a little bit more still. It made everything feel real and dynamic, and you didn't feel like you were exploring some arbitrary space. You felt like you were exploring a living, breathing place. So the first game idea I had was a exploration-based roguelike. And another reoccurring theme you'll notice, I'm delaying, is nearly all of my ideas are inspired by books that I've read. So in the Hobbit book, which is one of my favorite books as a child, there is a chapter where they're traveling through these enchanted woods, and there's this whole thing if you can't leave the path, and there are like these beautiful twinkling lights in the background and all sorts of dark, sinister things hiding there. And I've always really liked the idea of dynamic spaces. So what I mean by a dynamic space, like, so kind of like how, you know, in Path of Exile, if you want to go into an area, like say you want to open a map, you go to the map device, you have this random object in your inventory, you put it in, this little menu pops up. It's very gamey as a system. They've done a pretty good job recently of personifying, yeah, it's sort of looking like a tree, of personifying the Atlas, making it this living thing. But anyway, I'm getting stupid again. So the whole game was meant to be set in this enchanted forest that's impossible to escape from, because that's the main issue that I have with roguelikes, is roguelikes are really cool, and the only roguelike I think which did this well was Hades, with the whole loop, because roguelikes are just built around loops, right? So that you get to the end and then something happens and then you go back to the start. It doesn't really make sense. So what I wanted is I wanted a forest, and the whole point of the forest was it is an inescapable forest. You are doomed to forever be stuck in this forest. But that doesn't mean, and also well, one of the reasons I went away from this idea, because I brainstormed this thing. I'm like, this is gold, this is amazing, this is excellent. And then I played the Hades early access. I'm like, this game's already been made, but better. It then felt very derivative, but anyway. So yeah, the idea was it was this forest that you were doomed that you'd never be able to leave, but you wanted to explore anyway. And the gimmick that made this forest kind of interesting to give the player some kind of permanence, it'd be, you know, standard roguelike fare. We've all played stuff like Slay the Spire. You pick a path, you clear out a room, you then get presented options, you pick the next path. You know, clear space, option of where you go next, clear space, option where you go next, right? The forest would be separated into 4 different biomes. Each biome would have a distinct, like, aesthetic. So one place might be more mushroomy, one might be more typical forest, one might be a different season. That was another idea I had, like each biome would be one of the 4 seasons. But as you go through this world, you'll be encountering these beautiful, you know, fey creatures, beasts, and, you know, elfish style beings. When you kill them, you would like absorb their essence, because it turns out your character is kind of like a parasite. And then you would go from this decrepit, very simple looking being into this more beautiful being. But as you killed stuff through the forest, you would be draining the beauty out of it. So you would basically end up just turning everything into kind of like this marshy swamp. When you reached an end of a path, basically just like a dead end, right? We've explored everything we can in this direction. You would then have to backtrack to your camp, and you would have to go back through the same areas you've just been through. But now you're going through what was once this really beautiful forest this now disgusted, twisted, marshy swamp. All the beautiful fey creatures that you fought before are now like more decrepit and diseased. Like the majestic wolves now look like they've got mange. These once people, you know, covered in these beautiful robes and jewelry and ornaments, they're now like tattered wraith-like creatures, and all of their beauty is kind of being sucked up into your character. So the idea was, like, the longer a run went, your character would become more and more beautiful, but the world would become more and more ugly. And that was just kind of like an interesting kind of gimmick. And then what would then eventually happen is it's a roguelike, so you would die, all of like the juice, all the soul essence that you'd sucked up would be released back into the world. Everything would be returned back to its beautiful state. You would go back to like a wraith state. Or if it was like a Dark Souls, I never really played Dark Souls that much. What Whites or whatever they're called, you would kind of go back into that. And basically, the whole forest is just like enchanted, and it's an inescapable, undying forest. Everything in the forest is kind of tied to this thing, and there's all sorts of terrible allegories about humans, deforestation, this other stuff. Now, the other thing which made the game, which doesn't exist because it was just a bunch of scribbles in a notebook, the idea to make it feel more living and more real, and to make it different to other roguelikes, and I was really proud of this idea, was that when you ended a run, when you died, your build, like your previous character, would then become a roaming boss in the forest. Because one thing that roguelikes do really well, / really poorly in my opinion, is, you know, when you have that one like god run, and you're like, I'm so powerful, I face roll everything, and you can kind of reach like a tipping point in a roguelike where it then becomes boring, because you're just like face rolling everything, and then it's like, I'm just going to keep going until I eventually get one shot, and there's no longer any like pressure in that. I really like games with consistent difficulty curves. So because of the system where if you died, your like all your items, everything would exist as this like roaming boss, you would be afraid of doing well in the game. Like if you had too good of a run, in the back of your head you'd be thinking, if I die at this point, I'm then going to leave this really scary boss thing roaming around. So maybe actually what I want to do is, instead of just keep exploring all the different biomes, maybe I want to go back to my camp and like cash in all of this essence and soul that I've like absorbed, and like release it. I had this idea that'd be like these like god shrines or something. There'd be like different spirits, which you could align yourself in within the forest. So you could then kind of like sacrifice all of the souls to like the Raven God or whatever, right? So that way there's also this whole thing of not only are you exploring, not only are you going to different biomes, also different biomes would be more likely to have different items and power-ups of different builds, something I wish PoE would do, where if you're playing a fire build, maybe you're on these maps, because these maps give you fire items. Gee, do it anyway. So that was my whole like original first idea. And the way that I was going to hide a lot of the UI based elements, because I went on that tangent and I stopped talking about it, is your health wouldn't be a health bar. Your health would be birds. So your character, as you cleared through this area, this forest, you would encounter like magpie nests, and magpie nests would be the equivalent of like vendors. So instead of having like a merchant, because it wouldn't make sense for there to be a random merchant trading with this weird creature that's like sucking all the life out of the woods, it would maybe make more sense though for, you know, all your power-ups and upgrades to be like you eating certain magical berries, or you scavenging things from the nests of magpies. And I like magpies, they're a really cool creature because they collect things. So yeah, you would find these magpie nests, and for whatever reason, the magpies would be you would have an affinity with them. At one point, I was going to maybe have this like magpie god as a voice in your head trying to direct you through the forest. But anyway, you would find these magpie nests, and you would get to choose to either like take something from their nest. So, you know, the typical pick one of 3 items, but it'd be something that the magpies have picked up in their world. That would give you a buff. And then the magpie would join you, and each magpie would be like a Zelda heart. All damage in the game would be completely 1 damage. Everything is 1 damage. You would start off with 3 birds just flying around your character. You basically have 3 hit points. Every way, doesn't matter how long into run you are, everything does 1 damage. So there's no like crit scaling, there's none of that rubbish. And any power up you got would just like make your abilities more interesting. Maybe they would attack in a different pattern, so maybe like a single strike would then split into like 3. You kind of get the idea, right? But the other reason that I wanted this bird system, so like Dead Space, you're removing a health bar with this in-game thing. It then makes you care about taking damage, because if you take damage, one of these birds would like shriek and die, and that's bad. Like, that tugs on players' heartstrings emotionally, because hopefully you're not a horrible human being. You know, hopefully you don't want little cute birds to die. So yeah, this whole idea would be is you'd be like kind of going through this forest, defeating creatures, draining the life of the forest. And the other fun thing about it is the longer a run would go on for, the more of these birds would be like swarming around your character. So it's got like a good visual thing. The whole game was about visual progression. And it was very important to me that everything would always just be about visual progression. You would have this like safe space, which would be like your little camp with these weird god shrines in the middle. That would be the equivalent of like a hideout in terms of PoE. There would be a stupid like fishing mini game, because all good games need a fishing mini game. So that was my first ever like video game idea, and I've got notebooks with just like scrawls of writing on it. So that was like my first video game, and that was something I started planning on sort of start of 2020, end of 2019. So that was idea 1. And this was like this whole thing. It was this massive scope. But the one issue I always came back to, and you'll notice as I talk about like random game ideas, is I'm very much a visual thinker. And I tend to think of things that I think will be marketable. That was this other whole thing, just briefly, sorry. That whole game, because you want games that you can sell in a GIF, right? So it kind of makes sense. You can imagine the GIF of this like weird, like just like almost like a limbo black character to start with, going through this beautiful enchanting forest. It kills a creature, everything goes whoop, and your character like glows and becomes more interesting, more powerful. You can kind of like see the visual storytelling very quickly. You can then also see the thing of like these birds flying around you. You get hit, bird shriek, falls, dies. You die, like big explosion, all the fey creatures return, like, you know, visual stuff. And the other thing which would be important about that is it makes it very easy for people to like post highlights onto like Reddit or Discord or Twitter or whatever, because you can imagine that one guy who's had the god run, whose character's looking all amazing and like bejeweled, and he's got like 100 birds floating around him. But anyway, I'm getting distracted. So that was idea 1. Idea 2 was like the ultimate like epitome of that. I was like, okay, let's simplify everything, because that's way too ambitious, Tarke. Like, how would you get that made? You need all this art, you need all these assets. I completely botched moving that in the right place. Like, how are you going to be able to, you know, get that made? That isn't a realistic solo project for you to mess around with. Can I move up here? Did it do the thing? Computer's struggling a bit. So then I was like, okay, let's think small scale, shrink everything down, refine everything down. And keep in mind that I've been playing a lot of D&D at this point in my planning. So this next like idea series of notebooks filling up with paper, this would have been more middle to end of last year. So I've been playing a lot of D&D, so D&D then became this massive like influence on anything I was thinking about. Oh god, what am I doing now? So the next idea, also a roguelike, was going to be much smaller scale. And I played a game called Deck of Fate, Hands of Fate. I think it's called Hands of Fate. Hands of Fate. Yes, Hands of Fate. Hands of Fate is this interesting video game. Let's show you an image here that you can see. So this whole thing happens in a caravan. There's you versus this weird random dude, and he's laying out these like tarot cards in front of you, and that like dictates your story. And that whole aspect of the game was really good and really interesting. That had this horrible combat system, and the game kind of fell apart. But this part of it was cool. So my next idea was you were in a prison cell. The whole game was in a prison, and the inspiration for that was I read a random article about how prisoners play D&D. So D&D is apparently really popular in prisons, which kind of makes sense because, you know, nerds also like commit crimes, and you don't have access to many things, but you do have access to your imagination in prison, and you don't need all that much to play D&D. So it kind of makes sense. Like, you want to escape from this prison, right? You need a mental, you know, escape from the physical thing you're trapped in. Everyone's in lockdown. You know, it makes sense, right? But the problem with playing D&D in prison, the problem with playing D&D in prison is dice are considered gambling paraphernalia, and in a lot of prisons, dice are contraband. And if any of you guys have ever played D&D before, you kind of need dice. So you get a lot of things going on where people have, like, they might be lucky, they might have chill guards who kind of understand, like, okay, this is what these guys are doing, you know, this is healthy, we want people to, like, you know, reform and all that stuff. So you get some guards who are kind of chill and they won't stop down on it, but you'll have others who will, like, raid the cells, and, like, you'll in one cell they'll be, like, getting all their drugs taken, the other cell, like, some poor dude's getting all of his D&D stuff taken. So in prisons you get lots of, like, homemade like dice. So they would either, like, get tissue paper and, like, slowly compress tissue into, like, a cube, or you would make, like, spinners, where you have, like, a piece of cardboard, you get a paper clip, you stretch it out, you put it in, and then you just, like, write, like, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you spin it. Like, you know, spinners, you played Twister before, right? And they would, like, make all their own stuff that way. And I really like this idea of having to hide your video game, and having everything feeling really rough and really handmade, and going back to this idea of Hands of Fate. I really liked the visual storytelling of this game. So I was like, okay, so what if you had a game where you are a artist, like a drawer or a painter or whatever, and you're trapped in a tower, you know, kind of like medieval setting, and you are just being held prisoner. And the only thing you have access to is some paper, some ink, some candles, and that's that. There was, like, this stupid backstory where basically you were being held captive as, like, a political prisoner, and the king kind of liked you because he liked your artwork. So they kind of let you have your supplies, but you were meant to be doing, like, portraits of the king and writing letters on behalf of the king. But secretly you weren't doing that. You were actually just playing your scuff, like, solo D&D stuff, right? So the whole basis for that game was there would be, like, it'd be a first person, top down, turn-based RPG. So you would see first person from the point of view of the character. You would see the table in front of you, all the creatures, all the zones, everything you would draw, right? So you would draw it all, you would fight through, like, sketches, and you would be looking down on it. So that's why it's a first person top down. Does that make sense? Like, you're looking first person and you're looking down. And one thing I thought would be really cool is if at any point, if you wanted to, like, pause the game, instead of pressing escape and a stupid menu, like, coming up, no, you just look up from the table and you just look around your cell. And that's kind of like your free roam, is you just kind of, like, looking around the cell. Also kind of having, like, a lo-fi beats to study to sort of vibe to it. You know, with the, like, the girl doing her homework. You can picture, like, instead of a window, it's a window cell with just, like, a cutout look, you know. And that's like your only little idea of the outside world. It's just a plain, bare stone cell, a table, a candle on the end of the table, and it would have to be a real-time candle so that it would eventually like burn down and it would like have flickering light. And maybe when it burnt down fully, you'd have to reach down, press like E, pick up a new candle. Just stupid little things, but just to like sell this idea that you're actually in this like cell. The way that a run would end in that is that when you like died in your little doodling RPG, the equivalent of you just playing solitaire at work to pass the time, a guard would burst into your cell, see that instead of working on the political documents you're meant to work on, you're doing all this other stuff. He would trash your cell, rip up everything that you been doodling on and progressing on. And you would then be sent down to the king, who would give you a monologue about how you've betrayed his trust, all this other stuff, blah, 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 and then you'd be scolded and sent back to your room. And I was thinking, oh, it'd be really cool. You could have this whole mechanic where that when you're playing the game, maybe you could hear like footsteps coming down the hall, and then it's like, oh shit, footsteps coming down the hall. Quick, we've now got to hide everything under the table and make it look like we're doing the work we're meant to be doing. So then it became this whole thing, and I was making all these plans, but like, yeah, it'd be sick because it'd be like a video game about not playing video games. They'd be like, and I was trying to capture the, when you're a kid and it's past bedtime and you're under your covers reading a book and you've got the light on, or like playing Game Boy or whatever, and then you hear like, oh god, it's my mum in the hall, quick, turn the light off, pretend we're asleep. Sort of that sort of a vibe. So I got really like far along with like random ideas of how it would work. I'd gotten loads of have I got any on me? No, these are just random D&D notes. But I bought a bunch of Baldur's Gate 3 notes. I bought a bunch of cue cards, is that what they're called? Little cardboardy things. And I started writing out like skill abilities and all the classes, instead of it being like fighter, rogue, cleric, because boring. The classes that you would pick from would be based off of things that you're missing from the outside world. So there would be a class which was all around nature magic, but instead of like a druid, it was more like terrariums, because I'd gotten really into terrariums at the time. And it was the way that combat will work, because I realize I'm actually talking about combat in this turn-based RPG. The way that combat would work is it was sort of like a deck builder, like so it sort of have like a Banners of Rune sort of a system. It would be like a mix of like turn-based like Divinity, but with cards. I mean, it's pretty common deck builder roguelites. It's a thing, right? But yeah, like the whole nature magic thing, that would be like a combo deck. So you would have cards which would plant seeds. So if you imagine like there's a group of guards, right? And they're trying to bash your head in, you're actually not fighting them directly. You're throwing seeds at them. So like turn 1, throw seeds. Turn 2, water seeds while people are like bashing your head in. And then based on the seed you planted, they would have different effects when they bloomed. And it would make sense from a, someone just like, because the whole point of the game was essentially like you're just meant to be an artist doodling in a cell. You miss the outside world, you miss nature. There's this whole nature thing, it's all about growing, right? And then there was a different class which was like the take on a bard, but it would be all about music, and like maybe you tap along on the desk and like hum to yourself as you played your abilities. There was another one which was all about food, and that'd be like you'd self-buff yourself by eating food and drinking ales and that whole thing. But anyway, so we're getting into minutiae at that point. So that was the whole idea, and that kind of got far along. But with that idea and both the original idea, I kept coming back to combat, and I kept having issues with like, but what sort of combat system do I really want? Do I like combat in video games? And then I probably spent combined probably about 7 months realistically of like actual work doing like paper prototypes on those two like game ideas. And then I kind of just like stopped thinking about this whole thing of like, oh, making video games. I kind of like just threw that out and just stopped focusing on that sort of stuff. And then what started it recently, because in the last few days I've gotten back into, obviously, oh, it'd be cool to come up with some random game ideas. It came from a tweet, actually. So I get frustrated in life quite easily. And I get very frustrated when I don't have a game that I'm actively playing. Because it's one of my main hobbies, obviously. When I'm like in between games, I get really like weird. Let me see if I can find the tweet. This was it. Want to buy an RPG with classless systems, consistent difficulty that doesn't swing at endgame, limited but meaningful loot. Imagine rare plus monsters only. Whites and blues would be there basically for XP/fodder. A focus on exploration, not menus. A fishing minigame. And I made this tweet, and then like 5 minutes later, I was making a tea, and I'm like, wait, that's RuneScape. And I made a follow-up tweet saying, wait, that's just RuneScape. RuneScape is probably the most influential game for me. It was like the first video game I seriously got into. I played it all the time as a kid. A lot of my classmates also played it. I'm 28, so kind of like peak RuneScape was like me in primary and secondary school. So the timing was like brilliant. And we would just spend all day, instead of like doing maths or science or whatever, just in class, just like, yes, I'm gonna go home and I'm gonna collect all of this flax, and then this guy, oh, I'm gonna make clay, or oh, I'm gonna do this quest, and I was thinking like that game is, I still think that game is probably like the best MMO ever made. Its quest system is better than any other MMO in questing. And like, that is such an amazing game. And I'm like, that's visually like original, like OG RuneScape, super low poly, pretty basic. Like that's a massive game in terms of scope, like everything in it, all the different skills, all the different items, all the quests. And I'm like, that game had such a massive influence. Surely, Tarke, surely, and this is where my ego creeps in, surely, Tarke, if you try to make the most simplistic idea ever and represent it in like a super low poly, oh, that's way too small. A super low poly thing on just a bunch of flat planes, just like a proof of concept. Surely, like, that's within the realm of like even your, you're not that, like, you could do that sort of thing, right? Oh god. And I kept thinking about how, like, I keep getting trapped up on combat, because you can see that, like, when I think about games, I tend to think of them visually, as I think of, like, a gimmick. Like, I'm very much a gimmicky. Like, the first game that I talked about, that whole gimmick, was this exploring the forest. As you explore, it becomes more decrepit, you become more beautiful. The second game had this whole thing of, like, you were this artist in a cell, and then like little marketing things, like the first one have the animals and the cute little birds, and then you can post the gif of like all these birds following you. The artist thing would be very marketable, because it's this whole thing of like, you're an artist drawing in a cell. It's like peak Tumblr energy. Like, you can imagine people doing their own like fan art and stuff for it. And I think it's important that if you, because again, this is just me, because I think this is fun. This is me being like, I'm going to make a million, like, no, fuck that. Like, I don't have any interest in releasing games. I just find talking about games interesting and planning stuff interesting. So yeah, I was like, okay, so what's the simplest thing that you could make which had a gimmick? Because it's important to have a gimmick. And I'm like, I really like loot-based games, obviously, but most loot-based games do loot terribly, because most loot-based games either have uninteresting loot, or they have way too much loot, the point to which people don't care about loot. So how do we make a game about loot, all about loot? The loot is the entire point of the game, without combat, and we don't give the player much loot. Because one of the biggest issues, I think, with like loot ARPGs, looter shooters, or every game which tries to be an RPG, Cyberpunk was really bad for this. Just too many items. You know when you walk into a room, and instead of like exploring what's in the room or like fighting the enemy, you spend a minute just like stealing everything off all the shelves, off all the tables, and it's like someone's talking to you instead of being involved in the conversation. You're like looting 1,000 bodies. It's fun. It in a small thing, like, you know, when you're playing like Oblivion or something, fun, but like actually it's not good and it doesn't make sense. It makes the game not make sense. I was like, okay, so how can we have a loot-based game where it's all about collecting things, but not collecting too many things, with no menus, no random health bars, no mana bars, no abilities, and like nothing on the screen. And I was like, well, what if you just were a thief? And I'm like, okay, but then if you're like a thief and you think to games like Thief 1, Thief 2, Thief 3, oh, but then you'd need to make all these like really intricate environments, and that's way too, like, that's not something you could make. Like, that's way too intense. We need something like a really simple idea. And then I was thinking about a scene in one of the Witcher books, because again, most of my ideas come from books. And it's in like, I think it's like the third book or something. Geralt is traveling and he's trying to find Ciri. And at one point, him and his little band of followers, they have to travel through a battlefield. You've got the Pontar, which is this massive river, and they need to get to the other side of it. And you've got these two massive armies going at each other. And there's a really great series of chapters where they are trying to get somewhere, but they have to keep moving around these battles because they're trying to not get through them, and they're bumping into refugees, and there's this whole thing of like, oh god, how are we going to get around it? And then there's the whole problem of like, when there's battles, where there's bodies, you're going to have opportunists who are trying to scavenge from it. And I was like, oh, that'd be such a cool energy to have in a video game, where you have like a thief-based stealth game, where the way you decide combat is you just don't fight. And it's just, there are these massive battles going on around you. You're trying to avoid the battles, but also you're an opportunist. You're trying to like watch the battles. Like, you know that energy you have, maybe if any of you guys played like RuneScape or the early MMOs where you could like kill people, get their loot. You see someone with really good gear and you're like some trash level 1 character, and you know you could never kill that guy, but you're like, well, if I follow this guy, something else might kill him, and then I could steal his loot. And that was like the jumping off point. I'm like, oh, that'd be a really cool idea, where if you're just this dude who's just following these you're just following these armies, trying not to get caught by them, and you're just waiting for soldiers to die so you can steal their stuff. And I'm like, oh, that'd be really cool. And then I was reminded of Terry Pratchett, and I was a big fan of the Guards books. Is that like Bush in the right place? I think it might be. And there's Sergeant. Oh no, there's Sergeant Nobby Nobbs, I think his name is. I haven't read the books in a really long time, so excuse my. Is it going to be back there? So excuse my mistakes, but there's like, I think one of his introductions was about how he used to be a soldier, and he would, based on how the battle was going, he would change his colors. So if like the army with the blue crest was winning, he would quickly find a random soldier in blue who's died, swap armors with him, be like, and then actually if the red army was winning, he'd be like, well, take off the armor, don the red armor for him thing. And about like how you would steal boots off soldiers. And I'm like, yeah, that'd be cool. And then I'm like, what if we just had a game about stealing boots from soldiers? That'd be sick. But like in a really like low poly thing. I'm like, yeah, that could be cool. And then it's this whole thing where you've got this like just low poly open world game. It's kind of like exploration, trees everywhere, marshes. You hear the sounds of battle. You go explore it. You see some poor soldier like dying on the floor, and you're just like, yoink, take your boots, and you go off along your way. I need to blame my nose, sorry, one sec. And then I'm like, yeah, but then it's like, you've then got to render like all these armies, and actually that becomes super ambitious, Tarke, so then you need all these like dudes, and like, And I'm like, that doesn't seem like it's a unique concept. It's a pretty unique concept where it's like you basically have an ARPG, but you've removed all the action. Like, you've removed all the combat and everything. So I guess it's kind of unique, but it's not that gimmicky. And then I'm like, well, what's cool? And I'm like, I like goblins. Goblins are cool. And goblins don't create, goblins steal. And then I'm like, oh, what if you're this tiny little goblin? You're the tiny little goblin. And that way, because you're a goblin, you're not another human. You don't understand the humans don't understand you. Then the game needs no dialogue. And you've got a little cart. And because you're a goblin, you're small. So, you know, if a human's like 6 foot, 5 foot, whatever, maybe the little goblin would be like 3 foot, and he'd have a little cart, which would be the equivalent of like a toddler's thing. And that way everything becomes bigger instantly, so you can have a much smaller world. You know, grass would be like up to your head. And again, to keep it kind of like grounded, I'm picturing kind of like Tenderfoot Tactics levels of like environmental detail, right? Because like I'm not expecting like, you know what I mean? Like, let's keep this stuff grounded, you know? Like, I've never done anything before. And again, this is just kind of like a fun random thing. I'm not saying this is ever going to get made. I'm just like, this is going to be, I like brainstorming stuff. Be like, okay, what if you're this small little thing in this like big, scary, massive world? And there are all these stupid humans going about just killing each other. But you've got your little cart, and you're just going, ooh, boots. And you pick up boots, you fill up your cart. When your cart is full, that'd be kind of like your inventory being full. And there would be no menu. It would literally just be like, you pick it up, you place it in. You know, just like, and then it'd kind of be like the Untitled Goose Game, but of stealing boots from the dead. And then you'd take your little cart back to wherever your little goblin cave was, and it's just you. It's not like you're going back to a clan of goblins. And then you have this whole thing where it's like a really relaxed exploration game where you can just walk around this little goblin and go, oh, this is all pretty, with your little cart. But then you hear like the groans of someone dying on the other side of a tree. And you're like, ooh, stroll on over and just slowly just, you know, steal his stuff. And he's like, please help me. And you're like, I don't understand what he's saying. And then you go along your merry little way, right? And I'm like, oh, that seems really fun. Like, that seems like a cool thing. You could probably make that. You don't need any combat systems. You don't need anything. You just need, like, a plane, some trees, a couple of caves, and then some sort of, like, procedural generation for the sounds of battle, and then, like, dead soldiers. Maybe have some patrolling stuff. And I had this whole thing because I'm like, okay, but what happens if you get like caught by, you know, these humans? Because obviously you want to avoid them, and you want a game with some friction. I like the idea of frictionless games. By friction, what's a good example of friction? Okay, a big thing I've had recently is I really like CRPGs. So that's stuff like, you know, Pathfinder Kingmaker, Baldur's Gate 3, Divinity Original Sin, Pillars of Eternity. I really like those games. Baldur's Gate 1, 2, you know, CRPGs. But they have a lot of friction. And most of the friction of CRPGs is front-loaded in character creation. So what I mean by that is, and what I mean by like friction is like, it's anything which causes a negative experience for the player, the user, and make them likely to put down the game. So CRPGs have a lot of friction in character creation, because if you've never played the game before, which at some point no one's played these games for the first time, not sure they've played it for, you have no game knowledge, you go to create a character and they're like, pick one of 15 classes, pick one of 10 races, pick your subclass, pick your attributes, pick your feats, pick your this, and you're like, Wasteland 3, I really struggled with getting into that game, because I'm someone who likes to min-max. And the first thing that game gets you to do is make a squad of 4 characters. And it's like, whoa, wait, I need to plan everything from this early? Oh, God. And for a lot of people, that's not that big of a deal. They're just like, oh, I just kind of get on with it. Depth perception, by the way. But for me, that's actually like a massive point of contention, and it stops me from playing games. But if your game has no friction, then there's no tension. And tension in video games, I don't want to grab that. Tension in video games can be good because, you know, they're exciting moments. So like, okay, so how can we create tension in this little goblin game? How do I do this? Then I know there's an easy way of selecting everything, but I'm a complete noob with Blender, so I don't know. Can I then do like shift? There you go. That's everything. I'm a complete noob at Blender. So I'm like, oh, well, what if we had it so they don't attack you, like as in kill you, because then you then have to have player death. You then need to have like actual combat. You need to have health. You need to have all these systems. What if they just sort of like kick you? Because you're just this tiny little thing. In the scheme of a giant battle between two warring nations, this small, strange little creature, which isn't actually causing anyone any harm, it's just really a nuisance, just kind of like a pest. So maybe they just like, they kick you and they smash your cart and they take their like supplies back. So that way, you don't want that to happen. People don't want to be kicked. People don't want to lose their little cart of boots. So there's still a desire to avoid conflict. There's still a failed state, which would be losing your stuff, but you don't need to be mastering any systems, right? It's not a case of you need to be amazing at planning builds, you don't need to be amazing at combat. It's mostly about, you know, being an opportunist, planning your moments, and then because you've got this cart, it makes some slight friction in how you traverse through the world. So imagine there's like a ledge, and it's like, oh, well, I'm a small little creature, because then if you're very small and it's a 3D world, then how are you going to travel through this world? Because, well, maybe I'm going to have to find a detour, I'm going to have to find somewhere else I can carry my little cart around, I'm going to have to find a smooth point, or maybe I'll leave my cart here, I'll like jump on top of the cart, use it as like some basic platforming, so now I can get up this ledge, but now it means that I'll be able to carry less loot. Or, you know, if there's a battlefield nearby, I'll have to go and just get things one thing at a time and slowly bring it back to my cart. It then becomes less efficient. So then you kind of like, you design challenges and obstacles in different ways. I'm like, okay, this all seems kind of interesting. But then like, you need a little bit more going on than just, you know, a Death Stranding style delivery system of go to point A, go to point B, go to point A, go to point B. Yeah, okay, if we made it dynamic where stuff spawns in different areas, I guess that kind of makes sense. You're not doing the exact same thing every time, but you want some level of challenge. I don't want it to be a PvP game, so how can you simulate PvP? And one of the ideas I had in the Forest game was there'd be another person kind of running around. I kind of like the idea of having a rival. I think that's very powerful in games, like, you know, the original like Pokemon, like, ah, oh, screw you, Blue, like having that original rival, I think is really important. So I'm like, well, you're not the only scavenger in the wild. Magpies exist, vultures, foxes like to steal things as well. You could have other things in the world which are trying to steal from battlefields. Maybe other goblins, but I kind of like the idea of you being the only goblin. But it could be kind of cool seeing other little people with little carts just kind of like, you know, going about. And I'm like, oh, but that'd be really cool because with vultures, they fly. And if you're stuck on the ground and you've got vultures ahead, you can see them. And then that way it's, oh God, I've done something terrible there. That's ruined that model. Let's do an edit undo on that. If you've played Sea of Thieves, they have a really cool thing with like seagulls floating ahead over islands. And it can be a good way of signaling. And I'm like, oh, that'd be good. You can then have flying creatures. And yeah, I'm like, okay, so then you have other scavengers, and there's a slight sense of urgency because if you hear a battle, you want to get to the battle before any other scavenger can, but at the same time, you don't want to risk, you know, having a random human spotting you, smashing your stuff, right? And then I'm like, oh, this sounds a lot like a survival game. I don't like survival games. And I don't like survival games. I like the idea of survival games. I find eating, drinking, all of that stuff in games really boring. For someone who loves making hideouts in Path of Exile, I don't like building. I don't like Minecraft. I tried playing Valheim. I couldn't get into it because of the whole building thing. I know a lot of people play those games just for like Lego. But for me, if I want to play Lego, I would rather buy a box of Lego and build the blocks, not, okay, let's go and buy a bunch of plastic and then melt the plastic down. You know, it's just, I'm a different kind of person. I really understand the appeal of, like, I really like the idea of, like, leather work and woodwork and stuff. And I can understand the satisfaction of going, getting a tree, cutting down a tree, then turning that tree into a block. Like, I understand the appeal. But for me, I would rather have the assets at hand than to do it. I guess this is bullshit because I'm now making asset. But, like, this is, okay. For this, for example, I'm making a tree, but I didn't code Blender first. Do you get what I mean? Anyway, so that's the friction I have with survival games or, like, building games, that if I want to do something like Minecraft and I want to build a castle, I'd rather just have all the resources and build the castle rather than have the obstacle having to go and get the building blocks first. So the game wouldn't have any, like, crafting in it, because, again, goblins don't craft, they steal. But I do like the idea, if you have your little... Oh, I need to work out what this bush is going. You have your little cave somewhere, and, you know, you're putting all your spoils in there. Was that going to go there? My computer really is struggling with this. Oh, God. This must be really painful for any, like, pros. Like, Tarke, you've spent 40 minutes, 50 minutes, an hour, however long it's been, making a terrible-looking tree. Let's see, is that sort of in place? Click. Getting there, needs to go up a little bit. Still getting my head around this whole perspective thing. G. Sort of there, I think. So yeah, so basically to summarize, cute little low poly goblin in this big spooky world. And there are battles, and you're just stealing boots and trying to find other scavengers before, like, try and be aware of the environment, seeing where other animals, other scavengers and stuff are going. It kind of brings in that Ghost of Tsushima vibe of being guided by the little birds. But then those birds are also like a rival because they're also trying to, like, steal little trinkets from the battlefield. And yeah, that is a random Tarke rambles while making a weird looking tree. That sort of looks like, I think, to be honest, for my first tree, I think that looks decent. Can we get into, like, object mode? We can see it without all the little vertexes and everything. There's something I can press. That one. Okay, I need to make this solid somehow, and then we need to color it. But otherwise, I think that is a decent first crack. So I'm just going to save that for now. I'll mess around with that more later. Also, a quick question for any pros. I probably should have opened the video with this because most people would have clicked off by now. I was following the Grant Abbott well tutorial. And this is a well. And I need to make the roof next and, like, a little handle. This happened at some point. No. Edit mode is tab. Yeah. At some point, I accidentally linked all of these, so they're, like, their own layer. How did that happen? And how do I unlink these? Or are these just forever linked? Because I would like these to all be separate. So I'd want that, like, top ring of stone to be, like, one thing. I'd want that to be one thing, that to be one thing, this little middle thing to be one thing. Because them all being linked makes it very difficult when it comes to editing. And also, when I eventually go into shading and coloring, yeah, it'd be nice if they were all individual, so I could have these wooden beams be wood, and, you know, all these different stones be different colors. But yeah, complete novice, getting my head around it. Let me know what you thought of those terrible game ideas. I hope some of that rambling made sense. Probably didn't, because it was very piecemeal and I was distracted trying to make a tree. But yes, I'm Tarke. Have a good day. Nothing wrong with trying to, you know, try something new, by the way. Bye-bye.